another example was this woman was asking me about different like protein powders and pre-workouts. And by the end of our conversation, she left with a container of baking soda that cost her $1 because the benefit she was looking for, you could more effectively get from a quarter or a half teaspoon of baking soda before a workout than you could from like a $50 pre-workout supplement. And
So what was that benefit that she was looking for that you thought baking soda would be a better alternative?
so specifically, the conversation was for her son, who was an endurance athlete, and she was looking
Mm,
for basically improvement in endurance. And most people don't know this, but baking soda is one of the most well-researched supplements used among top-level endurance athletes, mostly
really?
due
Okay.
to the buffering of the
Right.
lactic acid that leads to kind of less of a
Yeah.
sensation. But I think there's
Mm-hmm.
also some benefits to oxygenation as well that play a role in that.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. That makes sense. I mean, when you said it, I thought, oh, okay, that must be. See, there's a lot of these things where I feel like it's very useful to understand, and this is one of the other reasons why this venture that I'm on is called foundational health. It's very important to just understand the basics of living, like of living beings, because then when you say something like take baking soda instead, my mind is immediately like, oh, it's probably at the very least buffering some things that are building up as a result of extensive output. And so, yeah, can you like tell us a little bit more about this because that's fascinating that can be, I don't know, is there literature to make the claim or experiences to support the idea that it's at least as good as protein powders?
So I think they do different things, but my position to some extent is that loading up on protein powder isn't always optimal. Like there's a threshold or there's situations where it's useful, but the average person doesn't need to be getting above 1 gram per pound of body weight. Let's say as kind of a ballpark in protein per day. And especially if you're living a sedentary lifestyle or you're not kind of doing that much physical activity, that extra protein isn't giving you kind of the return on your investment that you might think it is.
Hmm.
So what really interests me when it comes to, let's say, supplements, it's almost like in some of these materials blur the line between like, are they nutrients? Are they supplements? Should we consider them like a part of food? What really interests me is finding these like foundational materials that are things that the average person can take that are cheap, easy, effective, well tolerated, and something that you can kind of have in your cabinet, like baking soda, that has these sort of medicinal type benefits that really are kind of accessible and tolerable for everyone. So, with baking soda, I was researching some of the benefits of CO2 for
Hmm.
kind of oxygen delivery and some of the different aspects of that. And something I came across kind of in that realm was the balance between CO2 and bicarbonate. So, for example, when we're measuring CO2 on blood work, it's actually bicarbonate that's being measured. So
Yes.
it's kind of counterintuitive because if you kind of do a little bit of research on CO2, you'll see that it's a Lewis acid. It has an acidic effect, but the actual kind of low CO2 level in blood work is actually, I think it's metabolic alkalosis because or no, acidosis because you'd think CO2 is low, so acid is low, but in
Mm,
reality, bicarbonate is low, so acid is high. So it's
hmm.
acidosis instead of alkalosis. So there's different things like that that are kind of interesting or counterintuitive. And the interesting thing with baking soda seems to be that it sort of helps with the acid buffering, but
Hmm.
it also converts back and forth into CO2 because this
Hmm.
pathway goes in both directions. It's constantly shifting back and forth. So, what that seems to lead to is better oxygenation in the process. So, you actually see a lot of benefits from things like baking soda that seem to correlate with better oxygenation. And the mechanism for that is basically that when hemoglobin is carrying oxygen, it can actually bind with CO2 at its
Yeah.
sort of core nitrogen atoms that are actually holding oxygen in place. And when that happens, it reduces the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. So
Right.
this is called the Bohr effect. It gets discussed pretty often online now, but maybe 10 years ago, this was really unheard of or not common knowledge for most
Yeah.
people. And what this basically means is that you can have plenty of oxygen circulating in the blood,
Hmm.
but you won't have the tissue oxygenation if CO2 is low, or if the partial pressure of CO2 in the veins and arteries is lower than the partial pressure of oxygen. The oxygen just keeps circulating and doesn't get offloaded
Yeah.
into cells. So you see
Yeah.
sort of hypoxia in the tissue develop while the blood might look fine. And
Yeah,
then you
well, to
sort of
link
sleep it
this
off.
back to the baking soda, like as you're talking, and I'm thinking about because this is this might be new in the online space, but this is basic circulatory physiology from both my undergraduate education as well as medical school, which is that if you're generating a high acid environment in the tissue that you're using, let's say your muscles, you're working out, whatever you're doing, endurance stuff, then the bicarb, which is part of this equilibrium, is being used to neutralize the acid buildup
Hmm.
and it has to pull from the CO2 compartment, let's call it, to make bicarb to neutralize. So if you supplement with bicarb, let's say baking soda, then you allow the CO2 to maintain its normal partial pressure, and then that promotes the release of oxygen in the target tissue, which is
Exactly. Yep.
it's a very straightforward application of what we call the buffer in the blood. Another interesting one that I had personal experience with is with our second baby, mom, for like the first 2 weeks or something, he was getting really gassy and couldn't barely sleep at night. And everyone from online gurus to doctors to midwives were making recommendations to my wife about what to change about her diet, to do this, to do that, to avoid the other thing. And nothing seemed to help. And then one day it kind of dawned on me. I was like, oh, she's drinking a lot of sparkling water. What if that bicarb is making its way into the breast milk? Because, I mean, why wouldn't it? The breast milk comes from whatever's in her blood supply.
Mm,
And then that's causing the baby to be gassy. So she stopped drinking any sparkling water. And in 24 hours, his symptoms stopped.
that is fascinating.
And I was like, oh my God, sometimes it's just that simple. But people
Yeah.
sometimes want to complicate it. And it can be that simple. And to your point, it's like some of the basic constituents of physiology are really important to address before you start getting complicated. And whether it's with supplements and, blurring the lines between, at this point, I'm now thinking like, what's the difference between a prescription drug and a supplement? It's just that one requires a prescription. It's not like they don't have medicinal effects. It's not like they don't have risks and downsides. It's not like you can't overdose on them just like you can on medications.